Some men lose a job and walk away with an empty pocket, but Nathan Carter lost his in front of a room full of people who had come to watch what kindness would cost him. The afternoon wind over Millbrook, Pennsylvania, carried the smell of wet leaves, gasoline, and the first hard edge of November as Nathan stood inside Vance's auto with a wrench in one hand and grease darkening the cuffs of his faded work shirt. He was 40 years old, a white former Army mechanic with short brown hair touched by gray near the temples, a square tired face, and the calm, weathered look of a man who had learned to keep his storms behind his eyes. His faded olive jacket hung over a chair near the service bay, his worn jeans were dusted with road salt, and his rugged boots stood planted beside the open hood of an old sedan that belonged to a young mother from the edge of town. Her name was Lily Parker, and she had come in with 2 children in the back seat, a dead battery, and the frightened expression of someone counting every dollar before she spent it. Nathan had checked the cables, cleaned the terminals, and found the problem was small enough to fix without a full charge on the invoice. He had done what he always did when a simple repair could keep someone from sinking deeper. He fixed it first and worried about the paperwork later. Beside the bay door, Boone, his 6-year-old German shepherd, lay with his front paws crossed, silver gray and cream coat clean against the stained concrete, amber eyes watching every movement in the shop. Boone wore a simple dark working harness, and though customers often smiled at him, no one ever mistook him for ordinary. He listened too deeply. He watched too quietly. He seemed to know the difference between noise and truth. Nathan lowered the hood just as Russell Vance stepped out of the office with a clipboard in his hand and a smile that never reached his eyes. Russell owned the shop, the tow yard, and half the empty lots along Willow Creek Road, and he had the soft voice of a man who could make a threat sound like advice. He looked at the invoice, then at Nathan, then at Lily standing near the waiting area with her children holding paper cups of water. "You marked labor as courtesy," Russell said. Nathan wiped his hands on a rag. It was a 10-minute fix. She needed the car running. Russell gave a short laugh, and 2 mechanics near the tire rack looked down at their boots. "This is not a church basement, Nathan. It is a business." Nathan felt Boone rise before he heard the dog move. The soft click of nails crossed the concrete and stopped near his left leg. "I know what it is," Nathan said. "Then start acting like it." Russell lifted Nathan's time card from the clipboard and tossed it onto the metal workbench with a flat slap. "Clear your locker? You are done here." For a moment, the only sound in the shop was the ticking engine cooling beneath the sedan's hood. Lily whispered that she could pay something next week, but Russell raised a hand without looking at her. Nathan did not argue. He had repaired engines under desert heat, generators in snowstorms, and broken farm trucks for people who paid him in eggs, canned peaches, or gratitude. He knew when words would only make a small man feel taller. He walked to the locker room, gathered a dented thermos, a pair of gloves, a photograph of his father's old pickup, and a folded army patch he never displayed but never threw away. Everything fit into one canvas tool bag. That was the part that embarrassed him most, not being fired, but how little of a life could be carried out in one hand. When he returned, Boone stood between him and the office door, not growling, not showing anger, just staring at Russell with steady amber eyes. Russell looked away first. Outside, the sky was low and gray, and the parking lot shone with puddles from the morning rain. Nathan opened the door of his old blue pickup, the one with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked only when it felt merciful. Boone jumped into the passenger seat and turned once before sitting upright like a soldier beside him. Nathan climbed in, set the tool bag on the floor, and counted the money in his wallet without meaning to. $7.43. Not enough for a motel. Barely enough for dog food and coffee. He leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. The shop behind him glowed warm through the glass, full of tools, lights, and men who still had a place to be tomorrow morning. Then his phone buzzed in the cup holder. The screen showed a number he did not know. Nathan almost ignored it, but Boone leaned forward and touched the phone with his nose. Nathan answered. "Mr. Carter," a woman's voice said, careful and old-fashioned. "This is Clara Whitmore, attorney for the late Margaret Ellis. Nathan opened his eyes. Margaret Ellis had lived alone in a white farmhouse beyond Willow Creek, a widow with a stubborn furnace and a habit of leaving tea on the porch for anyone who came to help. Nathan had fixed her heat one winter night, and refused payment because the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees and no one should have been cold in a house full of blankets. Clara continued gently. Mrs. Ellis left something for you. A property. Nathan looked through the windshield at the darkening sky. I think you may have the wrong Carter. I do not. There was a pause, and paper rustled softly on the other end. She left you the Ellis carriage house on Willow Creek Road. The old one behind the maple grove. Nathan said nothing. The name stirred faintly in him, like a bell heard from another room. Boone sat very still beside him, ears lifting toward the phone as if he already knew that the day Nathan had been pushed out of one door, another, older door had begun to open. Nathan stayed in the pickup long after Clara Whitmore ended the call, with the phone still warm in his hand and the words Ellis Carriage House circling through his mind like leaves caught in a gutter. The parking lot of Vance Auto had emptied into evening shadow, and the glow from the service bays looked farther away than it was, as if the shop already belonged to another part of his life. Boone sat beside him without shifting, his amber eyes fixed on Nathan with that quiet patience dogs carry when they know a man is standing at the edge of something he cannot yet see. Nathan rubbed one thumb over the cracked steering wheel. He had $7.43, one canvas tool bag, a truck that coughed on cold mornings, and now, somehow, a property left by a woman who had once thanked him with hot tea and a paper sack of biscuits. He had not known Margaret Ellis well. Not in the way people measured knowing. He had never sat at her table for supper, never heard the full story of the husband whose photograph rested on her mantel, never asked why she kept the old carriage road cleared even after the main house fell quiet. But he remembered the night he first met her. It had been January, the temperature dropping towards single digits, and a neighbor had called the shop because Margaret's furnace had stopped working. Russell had refused the service call after hours. Nathan had gone anyway in his own truck with Boone beside him, following frozen tire tracks to the white farmhouse beyond Willow Creek. Margaret had opened the door wearing a blue sweater and 2 scarves, trying to smile though her hands trembled from the cold. The repair had taken less than an hour, a bad igniter, a clogged filter, a few old wires that needed patience more than parts. When warm air finally breathed through the vents, Margaret had closed her eyes like someone hearing music return. She had tried to pay him from a tin box in the kitchen. Nathan had refused. She had studied him then, really studied him, with pale green eyes that seemed older than the house. You are the kind who fixes things and leaves before anyone can thank you properly, she had said. Nathan had shrugged because truth always made him uncomfortable when spoken gently. Now, almost a year later, her lawyer was waiting for him downtown. Clara Whitmore's office sat above the old pharmacy on Market Street, reached by a narrow staircase that smelled of lemon oil, paper, and raincoats. Nathan arrived just before 6, after buying Boone a small bag of food from the gas station and saving nothing for himself but burnt coffee in a paper cup. The office door was open. Clara stood behind a walnut desk under the soft light of a green banker's lamp, a slender woman in her late 60s with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, and a face lined by years of listening carefully. She did not look surprised by Nathan's worn jacket, his tired eyes, or Boone standing at his side. In fact, she looked relieved. Mr. Carter, she said, Margaret described you very well. Nathan took off his cap. I am sorry about her passing. Clara nodded, and for a moment her professional calm softened into grief. She was ready in some ways, but never easy to lose. Please sit. Boone may stay wherever he likes. Boone walked once around the chair beside Nathan, then settled with his body facing the door and his head angled toward the desk. Clara opened a cream-colored folder tied with cotton string. Margaret Ellis left you the structure known as Ellis Carriage House, located on Willow Creek Road, including the adjacent half-acre, the original stone foundation, and all contents within the building. Nathan stared at her. Why would she do that? Clara folded her hands. Because you came when no one sent you. Because you fixed what was broken without making her feel helpless. And because, in her words, you knew how to leave dignity standing. Nathan looked down at Boone. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Margaret's name. Clara continued, but there are conditions. For the first 30 days, you may not sell, demolish, lease, transfer, or materially alter the carriage house. You must also spend the first night there, on the property, before the inheritance fully vests. Nathan let out a slow breath. That is unusual. Very, Clara said. But legal. If you decline or violate the terms, the property transfers to the Millbrook Development Fund. Nathan's eyes lifted. Russell Vance funds that. Clara's expression did not change, but something sharpened behind her glasses. Yes. Before either of them could say more, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Russell Vance appeared in the doorway wearing his charcoal overcoat, smiling as though he had been invited. Nathan, he said warmly, what luck? I heard about Margaret's little gift. I can save you a month of trouble. Cash tonight? No questions. Clara stood. This is a private meeting. Russell ignored her and placed an envelope on the desk. Nathan did not touch it. Boone rose slowly and stepped forward, placing one paw beside an old brass key lying near Clara's folder. His gaze stayed on Nathan, steady as a hand on the shoulder. The room became very quiet. Nathan looked at the key, then at the envelope, then back at the dog who had never once led him toward shame. No, Nathan said softly. I will stay the night. Russell Vance's smile remained on his face for one breath too long, the way frost remains on glass after the sun has already touched it. Nathan did not look away from him, but he did not give him anger either. Anger would have been easier for Russell to understand. It would have given him something to push against, something to twist into proof that Nathan was unstable, desperate, unfit to hold anything of value. Instead, Nathan only stood beside Clara Whitmore's desk with Boone's paw still planted near the brass key and said nothing more. Clara picked up the envelope Russell had placed on the desk and returned it to him without opening it. Mr. Vance, she said, this meeting is over? Russell glanced at the key, then at Boone, then finally at Nathan. 30 days is a long time when a man has no paycheck, he said softly. Pride gets cold at night. Nathan felt the words reach the places they were meant to reach. The empty wallet, the truck with a failing heater, the question of where he and Boone would sleep if the carriage house turned out to be nothing but a roof full of holes. But Boone leaned against his leg, warm and steady, and that small weight was enough to keep him rooted. I have known cold before, Nathan said. Russell gave a quiet laugh, slipped the envelope back inside his coat, and walked down the stairs with polished shoes tapping against old wood. Only after the street door closed below did Clara release the breath she had been holding. She crossed to the window and watched Russell step into the fading light of Market Street. Be careful with him, she said. Nathan picked up the brass key. It was heavier than it looked, worn smooth along the stem, with a small horsehead stamped into the bow. Why does he want an old carriage house so badly? Clara turned from the window, her face dim behind the reflection of passing headlights. Officially, because Willow Creek Road is part of a development corridor. Unofficially, Margaret did not trust him, and I have learned that Margaret's instincts were rarely wrong. She opened the desk drawer and removed a second envelope, this one tied with brown string and marked in Margaret Ellis's slanted handwriting. This is for you only. She asked me to give it after you refused the first purchase offer. Nathan accepted it carefully. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, cedar, and the closed rooms of an old farmhouse. Inside was a black and white photograph, folded twice around a smaller note. He opened the photograph first. It showed the Ellis carriage house in summer, long before rot and weather had softened its edges. The double doors stood wide. A maple tree shaded the roof. Near the back, where the horse stalls must have been, a young woman stood in a light dress beside a tall man in work clothes. At their feet sat a German shepherd with pointed ears and a pale chest, looking straight at the camera with such calm intelligence that Nathan felt Boone shift beside him. Clara leaned closer. That was Margaret and her husband, Samuel. The dog was called August. Margaret said he knew the house better than any person did. Nathan turned the photograph toward the lamp. Behind the couple, low near the base of the rear stall wall, he saw a small square door with iron hinges. It was not large enough for a person, maybe 2 feet wide, but it was clearly built with purpose. He unfolded the note. The message was short. The dog will know where the truth sleeps. Let him stand where the horses once stood. Nathan read it twice, then a third time, while the room around him seemed to settle into a quieter shape. Boone lifted his head toward the photograph and touched his nose gently to the rear stall in the image. Not the people, not the old dog, not the wide carriage doors. The hidden little door. Clara's lips parted slightly. Well, she whispered, I suppose that answers whether she meant any dog. Nathan slid the note back into the envelope and tucked it inside his jacket. The old fear of being used still moved through him, but now it shared space with something else. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too bright a word for a man who had learned to carry small lights carefully. This was more like a direction. Clara gave him the address, the deed packet, and a flashlight from her own supply closet when she learned the carriage house had no working electricity. By the time Nathan and Boone stepped back onto Market Street, evening had deepened into blue. The town was closing around them, bakery lights dimming, pharmacy sign buzzing, wet leaves sliding along the curb in the wind. Nathan drove west with the brass key in the cup holder and the old photograph on the dashboard. Boone sat upright, eyes fixed through the windshield. After 3 miles, the storefronts gave way to farm fences and dark fields. Willow Creek Road appeared as a narrow lane beneath arching maples, their bare branches trembling against the last light. At the end of it, beyond a broken stone wall and a gate hanging crooked on one hinge, stood the carriage house. It was larger than Nathan expected, a long timber building with weathered gray siding, a moss-dark roof, and tall double doors bowed by years of rain and silence. Dead leaves gathered against the threshold. A rusted horseshoe hung above the entrance, tilted but still holding on. Nathan turned off the engine. The sudden quiet filled the truck. Boone did not wait for a command. He stood, ears high, breath fogging the passenger window, his gaze locked not on the front doors but toward the shadowed rear of the building, where the old stalls would be. Nathan picked up the key and stepped into the cold. The air smelled of damp wood, dry grass, iron, and something faintly sweet beneath it all, like hay that remembered summer. Boone came to his side, not pulling, not rushing, simply leading with the certainty of a creature who had heard the first whisper of a truth buried under floorboards and time. Nathan stood before the Ellis carriage house with the brass key in his palm and the cold pressing through his jacket, as if the evening itself wanted to test his decision. Behind him, the pickup ticked softly as the engine cooled. Ahead of him, the old timber building waited in a pocket of silence at the end of Willow Creek Road, its double doors bowed inward, its windows filmed with dust, its roof dark with moss and fallen leaves. The place looked forgotten by everyone except time. Boone stepped onto the cracked stone path and stopped beneath the rusted horseshoe above the entrance, lifting his nose to the air. He did not bark. He breathed in slowly, then turned his head toward the rear of the building where the horse stalls lay hidden in shadow. Nathan had seen Boone track engine oil across gravel, find a lost glove beneath snow, and sense a loose bearing in a truck before the driver heard the grind. But this was different. The dog was not searching for a thing. He was answering one. Nathan slid the brass key into the old lock. For a moment, the door resisted with the stubbornness of wood swollen by years of rain. Then the lock turned, clean and sharp, and the sound seemed too alive for a building no one had used in decades. Nathan pushed with his shoulder. The doors opened on a sigh of hinges, releasing the smell of hay dust, old leather, cedar, dry mud, and a faint sweetness that reminded him of apples stored in a cellar. His flashlight cut across the interior. The main floor was wide and high, with thick beams overhead and narrow strips of moonlight falling through gaps in the siding. A carriage sat beneath a canvas tarp near the left wall, its wheels shadowed and still. Harnesses hung from iron hooks. Wooden crates lined one corner. A cracked mirror leaned against a post, reflecting a broken piece of window and the pale sky beyond it. Nathan stepped inside carefully, listening to the floorboards answer under his boots. This had once been a place of movement, he could tell. Horses shifting in their stalls, wheels rolling out toward town, men calling softly in early morning, lanterns swaying from hooks. Now every object seemed to hold its breath. Boone crossed the room with quiet purpose. He passed the carriage, ignored the crates, ignored the ladder to the hayloft, and moved toward the back stalls. Nathan followed, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. He told himself it was the cold. The first stall was empty except for straw darkened by age. The second held a rusted feed bucket and a folded blanket stiff with dust. The third stall had deeper claw marks along the lower boards, not fresh, not violent, simply old lines left by time, animals, and work. Boone stopped there. He placed both front paws on the threshold and lowered his head until his ear nearly touched the floor. Nathan watched him in silence. The dog's breathing slowed. His amber eyes narrowed. Then he tapped the floor once with his paw. Waited. Tapped again. Waited. Tapped a third time. The sound should have been dull against old wood, but beneath it came a faint answering note, hollow and low, like air moving through a hidden space. Nathan crouched beside him and ran his fingers over the boards. They were colder there, and a thread of air slipped between two seams, carrying the scent of stone and metal from below. He set the flashlight on a beam and brushed away straw and dust with one gloved hand. The boards looked ordinary at first. Weathered pine, square nails, old scratches. But near the rear wall, partly hidden beneath a strip of hardened dirt, was a small iron ring lying flat in a recessed groove. Nathan's chest tightened. He pulled gently. Nothing moved. He pulled harder, then stopped. Old things did not like being forced. He went back to the truck for his toolbox, returned with a pry bar, a rag, and a small bottle of oil he kept for stubborn hinges. Boone remained at the stall, sitting like a guard before a gate. Nathan cleaned the ring, worked oil into the edges, and waited while it sank into the rust. The carriage house creaked above him. Outside, the wind moved through the maples, dragging dry leaves along the stone wall. Inside, the building seemed to listen. After several minutes, Nathan wrapped the rag around the ring and pulled again. This time the floor gave a soft wooden groan. A rectangular section lifted half an inch, then another, revealing a dark seam beneath the stall floor. Boone stood, tail low but steady. Nathan raised the hidden hatch all the way and found a narrow stairwell descending into darkness, lined with stone on both sides and framed by beams that had not rotted at all. Cool air rose from below, clean and dry, carrying a trace of lamp oil, paper, and cedar. On the first steps sat a small tin plate engraved with words Nathan had to wipe clean before he could read them. For those who arrive with nowhere else to stand. He held the flashlight over the stairwell, and the beam fell on smooth steps worn by feet that had come and gone long before him. Boone stepped down first, then looked back. Nathan thought of Russell's envelope, Clara's warning, Margaret's note, and the old photograph with the little square door near the stall wall. Then he thought of $7.43, a lost job, and a woman who somehow knew that the truth would not be found by the man who shouted loudest, but by the dog willing to listen. Nathan took the first step down, and the carriage house above them gave one quiet creak, almost like a blessing. Nathan followed Boone down the hidden stairway with one hand sliding along the stone wall and the other holding the flashlight low, letting the beam search each step before his boot found it. The air changed as they descended. The damp chill of the carriage house faded behind them, replaced by a dry, steady coolness that smelled of cedar, lamp oil, paper, and old earth. The stairs dropped maybe 12 feet beneath the stall floor, then turned into a narrow passage lined with fieldstones so neatly fitted that Nathan stopped for a moment just to look at the workmanship. Whoever had built this place had not been hiding clutter. They had been protecting something. Boone moved ahead without hesitation, his dark harness brushing the wall, his silver gray and cream coat catching the soft glow of the flashlight whenever he turned. At the end of the passage stood a wooden door with a simple iron latch. No lock. No warning. Only a small horseshoe nailed above the frame, polished clean at the center, as if many hands had touched it for luck. Nathan lifted the latch. The door opened inward with a low breath of air, and the room beyond slowly came into view. It was not a cellar, not in the way he had expected. It was a long underground room, warm in color though no heat ran through it, with cedar shelves, a workbench, filing cabinets, folded blankets, lanterns, and 3 narrow cots made with army green wool covers. Along one wall hung old coats, boots, gloves, and canvas bags labeled by size. On another wall, a pegboard held tools arranged with the careful precision of a mechanic who believed order could be a form of mercy. Nathan stepped inside and felt the floor beneath him, smooth concrete, clean enough that the dust barely marked his boots. Boone went directly to the middle cot and lowered his nose to the blanket, then sat beside it, calm and solemn. Nathan lifted the flashlight toward a painted sign on the far wall. It read Ellis Way Station. Rest, repair, return when ready. He read the words twice because his mind did not accept them the first time. Rest was not a word men like him were often handed without conditions. Repair he understood. Return when ready sounded almost too kind to trust. On the workbench sat a large leather ledger beneath a glass paperweight shaped like a horse. Nathan opened the cover carefully. The first page held Margaret Ellis's handwriting, younger and firmer than the note in Clara's office. June 18, 1972. Samuel says every town needs a place where a person can arrive without a story and leave with enough strength to tell it. We will keep the carriage house ready. Nathan turned the page. Names filled the ledger in columns, some written in Samuel's square hand, others in Margaret's slanted script. There were dates, repairs, meals, rides arranged, small loans repaid or quietly forgiven, work references, bus tickets, nights stayed. A veteran traveling home after losing his apartment in Erie. A railroad worker whose car broke down with his family inside. A young couple who needed 2 nights and a warm breakfast before starting over in Ohio. Nathan traced one entry with his thumb but did not touch the ink. It felt too personal, like placing a hand over someone else's prayer. Boone rose and padded toward a row of framed photographs on the opposite wall. Nathan followed. The pictures showed people standing outside the carriage house across many decades, some smiling, some serious, all holding themselves with the cautious posture of those who had been helped without being made small. In several photographs, a German shepherd appeared near the stall door. 1st August, the dog from Margaret's old picture. Later, other shepherds, each sitting with that same watchful dignity beside people who looked newly warm. Nathan exhaled slowly. This place had been alive beneath Millbrook for half a century, while men like Russell looked at the land and saw only profit. At the back of the room stood a steel cabinet with a brass plate engraved with the single letter V. The mark was not decorative. It had the same sharp shape as the logo on Russell Vance's business cards. Boone stopped in front of it and gave a low, questioning sound. Nathan tried the handle. Locked. Beside the cabinet was a smaller desk with an envelope taped beneath the drawer. It was addressed in Margaret's handwriting, "For the one Boone brings here." Nathan sat down slowly, the chair creaking under him, and opened it. Inside was one page. Nathan, if you are reading this, then you honored the night and trusted your dog. The room you found is only half the truth. The rest is inside the cabinet. Do not open it alone. Bring Clara. Some men will call this old building useless because they are afraid of what it remembers. Nathan folded the letter with care. Above him, faintly through stone and timber, the carriage house settled in the wind. Below, the hidden room waited in warm silence. Boone rested his head against Nathan's knee, and for the first time since losing his job, Nathan did not feel erased. He felt chosen by a kindness patient enough to wait underground. Nathan did not touch the steel cabinet again after reading Margaret's letter. The single letter V on its brass plate seemed to watch him from the corner of the underground room, sharp and polished, like a name trying to remain important even in a place built for humility. He folded the page carefully, returned it to the envelope, and placed it on the workbench beneath the glass horse paperweight. Boone stayed close, not restless now, only awake in the deep way he became when the world had shifted and he was waiting for Nathan to understand it. Above them, the carriage house creaked softly in the November wind. Beneath it, the Ellis Way station held its own stillness, warmer than the night outside, kinder than the world Nathan had left Advance Auto. He knew he had to spend the first night on the property for Margaret's condition to hold, but he no longer felt as if he was doing it for a legal technicality. He was keeping vigil. He climbed back up once to bring in Boone's food, his bedroll, and the old thermos from the pickup. The main floor smelled of hay dust and weathered wood, and moonlight lay silver across the stall where the hidden hatch waited open. Nathan stood there for a moment, looking at the double doors, the tilted horseshoe, the carriage beneath its canvas covering, and the dark rafters overhead. All day, he had been pushed from one room to another by men who thought a paycheck gave them power over dignity. Now an old building was offering him more respect than most people had. Downstairs, he made a quiet meal for Boone, drank the last of his coffee cold, and sat on the edge of the nearest cot with his boots still on. The blanket smelled faintly of cedar and clean storage. Boone lay on the floor beside him with his head toward the stairway. Nathan tried to stay awake, but the room seemed to breathe him into rest. He slept for the first time in months without gripping the truck keys in his hand. When morning came, it arrived as a pale line of light slipping through the stall boards above, reaching down the stairwell in thin gray ribbons. Nathan woke to Boone sitting beside the cot, ears lifted toward the world outside. No alarm, only attention. Nathan washed his face with water from a metal jug marked emergency supply, straightened the blanket because leaving a bed messy in a place like that felt wrong, and called Clara Whitmore as soon as the hour was decent. She answered on the second ring. He told her only what Margaret had instructed him to say. "I found the room, and there is a cabinet she said not to open without you." Clara was silent for several seconds. Then she said, "I will be there in 20 minutes. She arrived in a dark green sedan, wearing a wool coat and carrying a leather document case that looked older than Nathan. When she stepped inside the carriage house, she stopped beneath the rafters and looked around with a grief so quiet Nathan almost turned away to give it privacy. She knew this place, he realized. Maybe not the hidden room, but the shadow of it. Boone greeted her with one soft press of his nose against her glove, then led them to the rear stall. Clara descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the stone wall. At the bottom, when the light revealed the cedar shelves, the cots, the coats, the tools, and the painted words Ellis Way Station, her composure broke only in the smallest way. She pressed her fingers to her lips and whispered, "Margaret, you kept it all." Nathan did not ask what she meant. Some answers needed time to rise on their own. He showed her the letter and the steel cabinet. Clara opened her document case and removed a smaller envelope sealed with wax. "Margaret had given this to me 10 years ago," she said. "She told me I would know when to use it." Inside was a slip of paper with 4 numbers and a sentence: "Only after the dog finds the sleeping truth." Clara turned the cabinet dial with careful fingers. The lock clicked open. Nathan felt Boone shift beside him, steady as a heartbeat. Inside the cabinet were folders wrapped in oilcloth, land maps, notarized agreements, bank statements, water access records, conservation contracts, and a trust document bearing the names Samuel and Margaret Ellis. Clara read the first pages standing up, then slowly sat in the chair at the workbench. Nathan watched the color move through her face like dawn entering a closed room. "This is why Russell wanted it," she said softly. "The carriage house is not the prize. It is the proof." She lifted a map and pointed to Willow Creek Road, the old lots behind the shop district, the water line, the parcels Russell had been gathering under different company names. Margaret and Samuel created a housing and trade trust for veterans, displaced workers, and families in temporary hardship. It was tied to this building, the creek access, and the land behind it. If the original records vanished, the development fund could claim the trust was inactive and absorb the property. Nathan looked at the cabinet marked with Russell's family initial. Clara nodded before he asked. His father was once a trustee. These papers suggest the Vance family tried to bury the obligation, not honor it. Nathan looked around the room, at the tools, the clean beds, the ledger of names, and Boone sitting beneath the painted words as if he had belonged there all along. Yesterday Nathan had been fired for giving a woman 10 minutes of mercy without a charge. Now he understood that small mercy had placed him on the road to a buried promise. Clara closed the folder with both hands. Nathan, she said, this trust may be worth several $1,000,000, but more than that, it is still legally alive. Margaret did not leave you an old building. She left you standing in the doorway of a promise this town forgot. Nathan stood in the underground room while Clara's words settled around him with the weight of stone and the warmth of a lamp. The promise this town forgot. He looked at the rows of tools, the folded blankets, the old ledger filled with names, and the steel cabinet that had held the papers like a buried conscience. Boone sat beneath the painted sign, calm and alert, his silver gray and cream coat catching the soft light, his amber eyes fixed on the stairway as if the house above had begun to speak again. Clara gathered the oilcloth folders into her leather case, moving carefully, almost reverently. These records need to be filed with the county before Russell can challenge them, she said. There are original signatures, maps, trustee obligations, and funding statements. If even half of this is still enforceable, the development fund has no right to touch the land. Nathan ran a hand over his face. Yesterday he had been thinking about dog food and where to sleep. Now people were talking about trusts, land access, and legal obligations that stretched back before he was born. I am not the man for this, he said quietly. Clara closed the case and looked at him over the rim of her glasses. Margaret believed you were. Boone rose then, crossed the room, and pressed his shoulder against Nathan's leg, the same way he had done in the shop, in the truck, in every hard hour when words were too thin to help. Nathan looked down at him and let out a slow breath. Maybe faith was not always a bright feeling. Maybe sometimes it was only a tired man choosing not to walk away from the door opened in front of him. They climbed back to the main floor just as morning widened across the carriage house. Gray light slipped through the dirty windows and touched the hanging harnesses, the old carriage beneath its canvas, the dust on the rafters. The building no longer seemed empty. It seemed awake and waiting to see what kind of courage would enter it next. Clara had just set her document case on a crate near the front doors when tires crunched over gravel outside. Boone turned first. His ears lifted, but he did not bark. Nathan already knew before the engine stopped. Russell Vance stepped into the carriage house wearing a dark coat and polished boots far too clean for Willow Creek Road. Behind him came a man Nathan recognized from the town office, a planning clerk named Dennis Rowe, carrying a tablet and wearing the uneasy face of someone who had been told this would be simple. Russell smiled when he saw Clara, but it was a smaller smile than the one he had worn in her office. Nathan, he said, I thought you might have reconsidered after a night in this charming old shed. I brought revised paperwork. More generous. Enough to spare everyone trouble. Clara stepped between him and the crate. This property is under active estate conditions. No sale will be discussed. Russell glanced past her toward the rear stalls, where the open hatch was not visible from the doorway, but the shifted straw and Nathan's toolbox told enough of a story. His expression tightened. You have been exploring. Nathan said nothing. Russell took another step inside, looking around with quick eyes. Old places can be unsafe, especially for someone without resources to maintain them. The town could condemn this structure if necessary. Dennis shifted uncomfortably. That is not exactly what we discussed, he said. Russell ignored him. Nathan finally spoke, his voice low and even. Is that why you came? To help me? The question hung in the cool air, too honest for Russell's polished tone. Clara opened her case and removed one folder. Mr. Vance, she said, before you say anything else, you should know Margaret Ellis preserved the original trust documents. Russell went still. Only for a moment, but Nathan saw it. So did Boone. The dog took one quiet step forward and stood beside Nathan, steady as a witness. Clara continued. The Ellis Way Station Trust remains attached to this property, the Willow Creek access line, and several adjoining parcels. Any development plan that depends on declaring it inactive may have a serious problem. Dennis looked from Clara to Russell. You told the board those records were missing. Russell's jaw tightened. Old paperwork is often misinterpreted. Then let the county interpret it, Clara said. I intend to file certified copies today. The carriage house was silent except for the wind moving along the roof and the faint creak of old timber settling into daylight. Nathan watched Russell look at the harnesses, the stalls, the canvas-covered carriage, and finally Boone. It was not fear in Russell's eyes. It was the anger of a man discovering that something he considered weak had remembered how to stand. He lowered the folder in his hand. You do not understand what you are getting into, he said to Nathan. This will become public. People will ask questions. Nathan thought of the ledger downstairs, of names written with care, of beds made for strangers, of Margaret waiting year after year for the right person and the right dog to find the room below. Then he looked at the old horseshoe above the door, still holding on after so many winters. Maybe they should, he said. Russell's face hardened, but he had no answer that could survive the room. He turned and walked back into the cold morning, with Dennis following more slowly, already typing notes into his tablet. When their vehicle pulled away, Clara released a long breath. Nathan stood in the doorway of the carriage house and watched the gravel settle. Boone came to his side, leaning close. For the first time since he had been fired, Nathan felt the shape of his life changing, not into comfort, not yet, but into purpose. The truth had climbed out from under the floor, and now it wanted daylight. Nathan and Clara drove into Millbrook before noon with Boone settled in the back seat of Clara's sedan, his head lifted between the front seats as if he understood that the papers in the leather case were more fragile than glass and more powerful than any tool Nathan had ever held. The town looked ordinary through the windshield: brick storefronts, flags moving gently over porches, a school bus turning near the library, people carrying groceries under a sky the color of pewter. Yet Nathan felt as if something beneath the sidewalks had shifted. For years, Millbrook had been a place that decided what a man was worth by whether he had a job, a house, a bill paid on time, a clean shirt without oil at the cuffs. That morning, he carried proof that some of the town's deepest obligations had not vanished just because powerful men stopped saying their names. At the county records office, Clara filed the documents with a precision that made the clerk sit straighter. Original trust agreement. Original land map. Original trustee obligation. Original access rights along Willow Creek. Certified copies were stamped, scanned, and entered while Nathan stood near the wall with Boone at his side, feeling more out of place than he had in the hidden room. The clerk, a woman with reading glasses on a chain, looked over the first few pages and then looked at Nathan differently. Not with pity. Not with suspicion. With the startled respect people give when a story they dismissed suddenly develops roots. By late afternoon, the news had moved faster than either Clara or Nathan expected. Dennis Rowe must have spoken to someone at town hall, because by 4 o'clock, the mayor had called an emergency meeting in the old municipal room above the fire station. Clara told Nathan he did not have to attend. He looked down at Boone, who was sitting by the sedan door with that steady, patient expression, and said he would go. The meeting room smelled of coffee, paper, and wet wool coats. Folding chairs filled the floor. Russell Vance sat near the front with his hands clasped and his expression arranged into calm concern. Several board members were present, along with shop owners, retirees, 2 reporters from the county paper, and Lily Parker, the young mother whose car Nathan had repaired the day before. She gave him a small nod when he entered. Nathan stood at the back, but Boone walked forward just far enough to sit in the aisle where everyone could see him. No one laughed. Clara spoke first, not dramatically, but clearly. She explained that Samuel and Margaret Ellis had created the Ellis Way Station Trust decades earlier to provide temporary shelter, mechanical training, emergency transportation, and practical support for veterans, displaced workers, and families in hardship. She explained that the carriage house was not abandoned property, but the physical anchor of that trust. She showed maps, signatures, tax records, and the original condition that required the place to remain available for public benefit. Each sentence made the room quieter. Russell rose when she finished, smoothing his coat. No one disputes the sentimental value of Mrs. Ellis's efforts, he said, but sentiment does not repair roofs or fund programs. Development brings jobs. Sentiment brings nostalgia. Nathan felt every eye move toward him, and for a moment he wanted to remain silent. He was good with engines, floorboards, wires, hinges, things that could be held and repaired. Words in public rooms had never been his trade. Then Boone turned his head and looked at him, calm as morning light through an old window. Nathan stepped forward. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to. Margaret and Samuel did repair roofs, he said. They repaired cars, fixed heaters, found beds, gave rides, made coffee, and helped people stand up again without making them explain why they had fallen. He looked at Lily, then at the older men near the wall, then at Russell. Yesterday I lost my job because I fixed a small problem for someone who needed help more than she needed another bill. Today I found out this town once had a whole place built on that same idea. A room where people could rest first and explain later. The words seemed to settle gently across the chairs. Lily stood then, holding her coat closed with one hand. He did help me, she said. I did not ask him to work for free. He just saw that I was scared and did not make it worse. An older man in the second row rose next. My brother stayed at the Ellis place in 1989, he said quietly. We never knew who arranged it. He came home with dry boots and a job lead. More voices followed, not many, but enough. A remembered meal. A repaired truck. A grandmother who had received firewood after a storm. Stories long separated from their source began returning to the carriage house like birds finding an old roof beam. Russell sat down without speaking. The mayor finally cleared his throat and said the town would suspend all development review on the Willow Creek parcels until the trust was fully examined. Clara nodded once. Nathan did not feel victory. Victory sounded too sharp for that room. What he felt was the first plank of a bridge being laid across something broken. That evening, he returned to the carriage house with Boone as snow began to fall lightly through the dark. He unlocked the double doors, stepped inside, and listened to the quiet. The place no longer felt hidden. It felt ready. Boone walked to the rear stall, sat above the secret hatch, and looked back at Nathan with amber eyes that seemed to say the truth had done its part, now kindness had to do the rest. In the weeks that followed, the Ellis carriage house began to change in the slow, honest way old places heal when people stop asking what they can take and begin asking what they can restore. The first morning after the town meeting, Nathan arrived before sunrise with Boone beside him and found 3 trucks parked along Willow Creek Road. Lily Parker had brought coffee in a metal thermos and a box of biscuits wrapped in foil. Dennis Rowe had brought copies of county records and a list of repair permits already marked urgent. The retired carpenter who lived behind the pharmacy brought 2 ladders, a tool belt, and the kind of silence that meant he preferred work to speeches. By noon, more people came. A plumber. A school counselor. A woman from the church pantry. 2 veterans from the next county who had heard the story from Clara. No one knew exactly what to say to Nathan at first, so they did what decent people often do when apologies feel too small. They picked up hammers, swept dust, carried lumber, cleaned windows, repaired hinges, and made the old building sound alive again. Nathan worked among them without standing above them. He replaced soft floorboards in the front bay, rewired safe lights under the loft, repaired the old carriage wheels so the vehicle could be displayed instead of forgotten, and built a wide workbench from salvaged oak. Boone moved through every room like a quiet supervisor, resting near the rear stall whenever anyone came close to the hidden hatch, not to keep them away, but as if reminding them to enter with respect. Clara filed the trust documents, and within a month the court confirmed what Margaret and Samuel had protected. The Ellis Way station still belonged to its purpose. The funds were not as endless as rumors made them sound, but they were enough. Enough to repair the roof without changing the soul of the building. Enough to keep the underground room stocked. Enough to start a small mechanical training program for people who needed a second chance more than they needed a lecture. Russell Vance faded from the center of town talk the way smoke fades after the fire is out. His development plan paused, then broke apart under questions he could not answer cleanly. Nathan did not celebrate that. He had no desire to build his new life from another man's embarrassment. He only hoped Millbrook would remember the lesson longer than the gossip. By the first deep snow, the carriage house stood with warm light in its windows. The double doors had been repaired but not replaced. The rusted horseshoe still hung above the entrance, clean just enough to shine at the edges. Inside, the front bay smelled of pine boards, coffee, clean oil, and soup from a slow cooker in the corner. A sign near the workbench read Ellis Way Station, rest, repair, return when ready. Nathan had carved the words himself, slowly, after finding them painted on the wall below. On opening night, there was no stage, no ribbon, no polished ceremony. People came in winter coats and work boots. Some brought canned food. Some brought blankets. Some came only to stand in the doorway and look ashamed in a hopeful way. Clara placed Margaret's photograph on a small shelf beside the brass key and the old picture of Samuel, August, and the carriage house in summer. Nathan stood beside it for a long time, his faded olive jacket brushed clean, his hands still marked with work, his face calm but softer than it had been in years. Lily's children sat cross-legged near Boone, who allowed one mittened hand to rest gently against his harness while he watched the room with patient amber eyes. Later that evening, after the last visitor had gone and snow covered the tire tracks outside, Nathan walked down to the hidden room alone except for Boone. The underground lights glowed warmly over the cots, the coats, the ledger, and the tools arranged in careful rows. He opened the ledger to a fresh page. His hand paused over the first blank line. For years he had believed his life was becoming smaller, reduced to a truck cab, a tool bag, and the next repair no one would remember. Now the page before him seemed wide enough to hold a future. He wrote the date, then the first entry of the restored Ellis Way Station. Open doors tonight. Coffee served. 5 coats given. 1 man asked about work. 1 family will return tomorrow. Boone found the truth first. Nathan closed the ledger and rested his palm on the cover. Above him, the carriage house creaked softly in the winter wind, not like a lonely building anymore, but like an old ship ready to carry people across rough water. Boone leaned against his leg, warm and steady. Nathan had been fired, broke, and nearly convinced that kindness was a habit the world punished. But sometimes kindness travels underground. Sometimes it waits beneath old floorboards, inside locked cabinets, in the memory of a widow, in the loyalty of a dog, until the right weary soul arrives with enough humility to listen. Nathan reached up and turned off the last lamp, leaving one small light burning by the stairs for whoever might come next.